And this is the moment when the feeling inside him begins to reveal its hidden contradiction, because love, when it grows in the depths of the unconscious, rarely arrives as something simple or pure without tension. I have watched this pattern unfold in many hearts, where devotion rises like a quiet tide, yet hesitation forms like a shadow along the shore. He feels drawn toward you with a sincerity he cannot easily deny, but another force within him whispers warnings, questions, memories, and doubts that he has never fully understood. What appears on the surface as distance or confusion is often the outer expression of an inner conflict that has been forming for years. We tend to imagine love as clarity, yet the psyche is not built on clarity alone. It is built on layers, some conscious, some hidden, some forgotten but still alive beneath our awareness. When he looks at you, something ancient inside him awakens, something that recognizes familiarity, warmth, and possibility. But alongside that recognition, another part of him tightens, guarding old wounds that were never given language or resolution. This is where the shadow begins to speak without words. Not as a monster, not as an enemy, but as a keeper of unfinished stories. The shadow holds every moment when trust felt dangerous, every memory where vulnerability seemed to lead to loss, and every belief formed in silence when no one was there to explain what was happening inside. So when love reaches him now, especially a love that feels genuine, the shadow does not celebrate immediately. Instead, it hesitates, it watches, it measures the risk of being seen too deeply. I often notice that when a man loves deeply yet behaves with uncertainty, he is not resisting love itself. He is resisting the possibility of transformation that love demands. To love someone truly means allowing parts of oneself to change, to soften, to open spaces that were once tightly sealed, and that is rarely comfortable. The unconscious mind protects what is familiar, even when the familiar is painful. It prefers predictable discomfort over unpredictable growth. So he stands between two inner voices, one calling him closer, the other pulling him back into safety. There is also an archetypal dimension moving quietly beneath his actions. Somewhere inside him lives the image of who he believes he must be, the protector, the survivor, the one who does not lose control. This identity was shaped long before he met you. It was built through repetition, expectation, and silent agreements made with the world around him. When love begins to challenge this identity, he feels something unsettling, not because you are wrong for him, but because loving you may require him to release an old version of himself that once kept him secure. And here is where complexity deepens. Because love does not simply connect two people, it activates their inner worlds. When he feels your presence, he does not only see you as you are, he also senses reflections of his own unfinished self. Your kindness may remind him of moments he once longed for. Your strength may confront his own hidden vulnerability. Your patience may expose how much he fears disappointing someone who truly sees him. These reflections create tension, not because he doubts your worth, but because he is beginning to see parts of himself that he once avoided. This inner tension can appear in small behaviors that seem confusing from the outside. One day he moves closer, revealing warmth and tenderness that feels undeniable. Another day he withdraws, creating distance that feels unnecessary or even painful. Yet inside him, these movements are not random. They are attempts to balance the longing for connection with the instinct for protection. It is like watching someone stand at the edge of deep water, feeling the urge to dive, yet remembering how cold and overwhelming the first step can feel. We often underestimate how powerful early emotional patterns can be. The psyche remembers what the mind forgets. Even when he believes he is ready for love, deeper layers of memory may still hold unresolved fears. Perhaps he learned, without realizing it, that closeness leads to pressure, or that vulnerability invites judgment, or that expressing affection risks rejection. These silent lessons form invisible boundaries inside him. So when he begins to love you, he is not only responding to your presence, he is negotiating with his own past, trying to decide whether this time will be different. Individuation, the slow journey toward becoming whole, rarely happens without friction. Love becomes one of its most powerful catalysts because it reveals contradictions that daily life can easily hide. Through loving you, he encounters his own incompleteness. He sees where he feels strong and where he feels fragile. He notices how much he desires connection, yet how deeply he fears losing himself within it. This is not weakness, it is the psyche reorganizing itself, attempting to integrate parts that were once separated by fear and survival. And as this process unfolds, something subtle begins to shift within him. He starts to recognize that the complication you sense is not created by you alone, nor by circumstances alone, but by the meeting of his conscious intentions with his unconscious defenses. The love he feels is real, yet the path toward expressing it fully requires him to face aspects of himself that he once avoided. That is why his affection may feel both steady and uncertain at the same time, because deep within him something is preparing to change, yet another part still hesitates at the threshold of becoming someone he has never fully allowed himself to be. And I have seen how this threshold creates a strange silence inside a person. It is not the silence of indifference, but the silence of inner negotiation. Part of him stands at the door of transformation, sensing that loving you deeply would mean stepping beyond the limits of who he once believed he had to remain. Yet another part clings to the identity that kept him safe for so long. This is the quiet war between the familiar self and the emerging self. We rarely recognize how much of our behavior is shaped by invisible loyalties to our past. A man who loves you but seems complicated is often carrying an unconscious promise to remain guarded, to remain independent, to never appear weak in the eyes of others or even in his own reflection. These promises were never spoken aloud. They were formed through repeated emotional experiences, through moments when openness felt dangerous, or when trust was met with disappointment. So now, when love reaches him in a form that feels sincere, warm, and alive, his psyche reacts in two directions at once. One movement flows toward you with authenticity. The other movement pulls him backward into old protective patterns. This creates the paradox you feel, the sense that his love is present, yet surrounded by invisible walls. And here is something many people misunderstand. Complication in love is rarely about lack of feeling. More often, it is about excess feeling meeting unhealed structure. Inside him, affection may be growing with remarkable depth. But depth alone does not guarantee expression. Expression requires permission from the inner world. It requires the psyche to feel safe enough to reveal what has long been hidden. And if his shadow still holds unresolved pain, then every moment of closeness may feel both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I often notice that men who love deeply yet struggle to show it outwardly are confronting their own shadow without realizing it. The shadow does not only contain anger or fear, it also contains tenderness that was never allowed to exist openly. It contains longing that was once dismissed. It contains softness that was mistaken for weakness. So when he feels love for you, he may feel a surge of emotion that surprises even himself, a warmth that feels unfamiliar, a vulnerability that disrupts the image he has carefully built. This disruption can feel threatening, not because love is harmful, but because it challenges the mask he once believed was necessary for survival. And masks, once worn long enough, begin to feel like identity. There is also the matter of projection, one of the most subtle forces in human relationships. When he looks at you, he may unconsciously project parts of his own inner world onto your presence. He may see not only who you are, but who he fears losing, who he hopes to protect, or who he secretly longs to become. These projections can intensify emotions beyond what logic can explain. This is why his reactions may sometimes feel larger than the situation itself, why a simple moment of closeness may stir unexpected distance, why tenderness may be followed by hesitation. It is not because the feeling disappears, but because the unconscious becomes activated, stirring memories and patterns that have remained untouched for years. And yet, within this complication, there is also possibility, because when love reaches a place where it disturbs the old structure of the self, transformation becomes unavoidable. Even if he resists, even if he withdraws at times, the experience of loving you begins to reshape his internal landscape. He starts to question beliefs he once accepted without reflection. He begins to notice patterns he never saw before. He becomes aware of contradictions inside himself that were once invisible. This awareness is not comfortable. It creates tension, uncertainty, and sometimes distance, but it also creates movement. The psyche begins to shift from unconscious reaction toward conscious choice. He may not yet know how to express what he feels. He may not yet trust his own capacity for emotional openness, but the process has already begun, quietly altering the structure of his inner world. Another layer of this complication often lies in his relationship with control. Many individuals develop the belief that control equals safety. They learn to regulate emotions tightly, to maintain composure, to avoid unpredictable vulnerability. Love, however, invites surrender. Not surrender to another person, but surrender to emotional authenticity. And this surrender feels risky. To love you fully would mean allowing uncertainty. It would mean admitting that he cannot predict every outcome. It would mean trusting that emotional closeness does not automatically lead to loss or betrayal. For someone whose unconscious still associates vulnerability with danger, this step feels enormous. It feels like standing in unfamiliar territory without armor, so he moves slowly, sometimes without realizing why. He tests emotional distance the way one tests water before stepping in fully. He approaches connection with caution, not because he doubts you, but because he doubts whether his own inner world is ready for the depth he feels. And this hesitation can be deeply misunderstood. From the outside, it may appear as indecision or inconsistency, but from within it feels like survival logic attempting to adapt to new emotional realities. What fascinates me most is how love reveals the dual nature of the psyche. Within him, devotion and fear can coexist without canceling each other. Attraction and hesitation can live side by side. Desire for closeness can exist alongside the urge to retreat. This duality is not evidence of confusion alone. It is evidence of depth. Depth always brings complexity, and as he continues to feel drawn toward you, another subtle shift begins to occur. The parts of him that once resisted vulnerability start to observe the safety you represent. The unconscious begins collecting new evidence. Moments where closeness did not lead to harm, moments where openness did not result in rejection. These experiences slowly rewrite the internal narrative he once believed was unchangeable. But this rewriting takes time. It requires repetition, patience, and emotional presence. It requires him to witness again and again that love does not have to mirror past pain. And with each new moment of connection, the old defenses weaken slightly, even if he does not consciously recognize the change. Yet there remains one final complication that often stays hidden even from himself. Because beneath his hesitation, beneath his longing, beneath his attempts to protect his identity, there may exist a deeper question forming quietly in the unconscious. A question about whether he is truly ready to face the version of himself that will emerge if he allows this love to unfold without resistance. Without resistance, because allowing love to unfold fully does not simply change a relationship, it changes the structure of the self that has existed for years. And this is where the inner dialogue becomes more intense, even if no words are spoken aloud. A silent question begins to circulate within him. If I allow this feeling to grow, who will I become? not in a superficial sense, but in a deeper psychological way that touches his identity, his habits, and his long-protected defenses. I have noticed that when love reaches this level of depth, it stops being only about attraction or companionship. It becomes an invitation into individuation, the slow and sometimes uncomfortable process of becoming more whole. He may not consciously name it this way, but he feels the pressure of it. A pressure to confront parts of himself that have lived quietly in the background for years. One of these parts is often his hidden vulnerability. Many people carry an inner narrative that vulnerability equals exposure, and exposure equals risk. This narrative is rarely questioned because it once served a purpose. It protected him during moments when trust felt fragile or when emotional expression was misunderstood. Over time, this protection became automatic. It shaped the way he responded to closeness, affection, and emotional intimacy. But now, with you, something interrupts that pattern. Your presence may feel safe in a way that confuses him, safe yet unfamiliar, comforting yet challenging. This paradox creates a psychological tension that is difficult to explain from the outside. Because while he feels drawn toward you, he also feels the weight of expectations he has placed upon himself. Expectations to remain steady, composed, and in control. And love, true love, does not always respect control. Love asks questions that logic cannot easily answer. It pushes him to feel emotions he once managed carefully. It invites him to reveal thoughts he once kept hidden, and perhaps most unsettling of all, it encourages him to depend, not in weakness, but in shared humanity. This idea alone can feel threatening to someone who has spent years believing that strength means standing alone. So his complication is not random, it is structured. It follows invisible patterns formed long before your connection began. Patterns that repeat until they are brought into awareness, patterns that whisper warnings even when there is no real danger present. This is why you may sometimes sense hesitation in moments that feel emotionally significant. He may pause before expressing affection. He may retreat slightly after moments of closeness. He may overthink situations that appear simple from your perspective. These reactions are not necessarily signs of doubt in you, they are signs of inner recalibration, his psyche adjusting to unfamiliar emotional territory. There is also another layer that rarely receives attention, the fear of being truly seen. To be seen deeply means to allow another person to witness not only strengths but insecurities, contradictions, and unresolved fragments of the self. Many individuals fear this level of visibility because it challenges the carefully maintained image they present to the world. He may have spent years constructing an identity that appears stable and self-sufficient, yet beneath that image, there may exist questions he has never fully answered about his own worth, his own fears, and his own emotional depth. When he feels your presence observing him with genuine understanding, something shifts. Not outwardly at first, but internally. He senses that the mask he wears may not be necessary in your presence, and this realization, while comforting, can also feel destabilizing, because removing a mask requires courage, and courage requires trust, not only in another person, but in oneself. Trusting himself to feel deeply may be one of his greatest challenges. Somewhere within his unconscious lives, the memory of moments when feelings were overwhelming or misunderstood. These memories do not disappear simply because time has passed. They remain stored as emotional impressions, shaping his reactions in subtle ways. So when love grows between you, those impressions awaken, influencing his behavior even when he cannot explain why. And yet, despite this internal struggle, love continues to grow in quiet ways, often beneath the surface, beyond obvious gestures or dramatic expressions. It shows itself in attention, in observation, in the subtle ways he remembers details about you. These quiet forms of affection are often overlooked because they lack spectacle, but psychologically they reveal depth, they reveal presence, they reveal emotional investment that may be difficult for him to verbalize. This is where patience becomes a psychological force rather than a passive act. Not patience that tolerates neglect, but patience that recognizes transformation as a gradual process. When someone confronts their own shadow through love, progress rarely happens in sudden leaps. It happens through repeated moments of awareness, small realizations that slowly accumulate into lasting change. And as these realizations gather, something unexpected begins to happen within him. The protective barriers that once felt immovable start to soften, not disappear entirely, but loosen. He begins to recognize that vulnerability does not always lead to harm. That emotional openness does not automatically create loss. That closeness can exist without sacrificing identity. This recognition is subtle at first, almost invisible. But its effects are powerful, because when the psyche begins to trust new experiences, it gradually releases old defenses. The shadow, once rigid and guarded, becomes more flexible. It allows new emotional patterns to emerge. It permits curiosity where fear once dominated. And within this shifting landscape, his feelings for you begin to take on new clarity, less defensive, more conscious. Yet even as this clarity develops, another tension quietly forms beneath the surface. Because loving you deeply does not only require him to face vulnerability, it also requires him to confront responsibility. The responsibility of choosing connection over avoidance, presence over retreat, honesty over silence. This responsibility can feel heavy, especially for someone who has spent years navigating relationships cautiously. He may begin to sense that continuing this path will demand action, not grand gestures, but consistent emotional presence. And consistency is often the true test of transformation. It requires him to move beyond internal reflection into external expression, to align what he feels inside with what he demonstrates outside. And this alignment is where many individuals hesitate the most, not because they lack feeling, but because they recognize that once they step fully into emotional truth, there is no returning to the safety of emotional distance in the same way. Because once the psyche tastes genuine closeness, the illusion of distance loses some of its power. Something inside him begins to understand that avoiding emotion no longer provides the same comfort it once did. The familiar defenses start to feel heavier, less natural, almost outdated, and this is when the deeper layers of his unconscious begin to reorganize themselves. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through quiet internal shifts that he may not even recognize at first. He may feel more reflective than usual, more aware of his own reactions, more curious about why certain emotions arise in your presence. These moments of reflection are signs that his psyche is turning inward, examining its own patterns rather than blindly repeating them. I have seen how this stage creates a strange mixture of clarity and confusion. Clarity because he begins to recognize the depth of his feelings for you. Confusion because he does not yet fully trust his ability to hold those feelings without fear. It is like holding something fragile in unfamiliar hands, wanting to protect it, yet unsure of how tightly to hold. This uncertainty is often misinterpreted as emotional distance, but in reality it may be emotional awakening, the moment when he realizes that what he feels is not temporary or superficial, but rooted in something much deeper than simple attraction, and depth changes the rules. It demands awareness, responsibility, and courage. One of the most powerful forces operating within him now is the tension between his conscious desire and his unconscious resistance. Consciously, he may wish to move closer, to express what he feels, to allow the relationship to deepen. Unconsciously, however, older patterns may still whisper warnings, reminding him of past disappointments, past misunderstandings, or moments when vulnerability felt unsafe. These whispers are rarely logical. They do not present arguments. They create sensations, tightness in the chest, hesitation in speech, a sudden urge to withdraw without clear reason. This is the language of the unconscious. It speaks through feeling rather than explanation. And until these feelings are recognized and understood, they continue shaping behavior in subtle but powerful ways. There is also a deeper archetypal movement unfolding within him, one that relates to identity and transformation. When a man loves deeply, he often encounters an inner image of who he could become. This image is not imposed from outside, it emerges from within, carrying both possibility and fear. It asks him to grow beyond old definitions of strength and to embrace a more balanced sense of self, one that includes sensitivity alongside resilience. But growth always demands sacrifice. Not the loss of something valuable, but the release of something outdated. He may sense that to love you fully, he must let go of certain defenses, certain habits of emotional withdrawal, certain beliefs that once defined his understanding of relationships. Letting go of these patterns can feel like losing a part of himself, even when that part no longer serves him. And so he hesitates, not because he doubts you, but because he is learning to trust a new version of himself. This process often creates subtle behavioral shifts that are easy to overlook. He may become more attentive in quiet ways, observing rather than reacting. He may listen more carefully, trying to understand not only your words but the emotions beneath them. He may reflect on conversations long after they end, replaying moments in his mind as he searches for deeper meaning. These behaviors reveal an inner reorientation. His psyche is moving from automatic defense toward conscious engagement. This transition is rarely smooth. It involves moments of progress followed by moments of retreat. Like waves approaching the shore, he moves forward, then pulls back, then moves forward again, each time coming slightly closer than before. What complicates this movement further is the presence of self-doubt. Beneath his affection for you, there may exist questions about his own worthiness, questions he rarely expresses aloud. He may wonder whether he is capable of sustaining the emotional depth he feels, whether he can meet the expectations he imagines you hold, whether revealing his full emotional world might lead to rejection or disappointment. Self-doubt is one of the quietest forces shaping human behavior. It does not shout. It lingers in the background, influencing decisions without obvious visibility. And when combined with deep affection, it creates hesitation, not because love is absent, but because fear of inadequacy begins to surface. Another element begins to emerge at this stage, the desire for authenticity. The more he reflects on his feelings, the less satisfied he becomes with superficial interaction. He begins to sense that surface-level connection is no longer enough. Something within him seeks depth, honesty, and emotional truth. This desire can feel overwhelming, especially if he has spent years navigating relationships through caution rather than openness. Authenticity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. Not blind trust, but earned trust, built through repeated experiences of safety and understanding. With each interaction that feels genuine, his internal defenses adjust slightly. They loosen just enough to allow new emotional experiences to enter without immediate resistance. And yet, even as this transformation unfolds, there remains a lingering uncertainty about timing. He may feel the urge to express more than he currently does, yet hesitate because he fears moving too quickly or revealing too much. Timing, in psychological terms, is deeply connected to readiness. Not only readiness for connection, but readiness for self-exposure. He is learning, perhaps without realizing it, that loving you is not only about revealing affection, it is about confronting himself, about recognizing how his past shapes his present reactions, about understanding how fear and longing can coexist within the same emotional space. This realization can feel heavy at times, not painful in the obvious sense, but weighty, like carrying responsibility for a transformation that cannot be reversed. because once he begins to see himself more clearly, he cannot return to unconscious behavior without feeling the tension of awareness. And awareness changes everything. It alters the way he interprets silence, the way he responds to closeness, the way he understands his own emotional responses. He begins to notice patterns that once passed unnoticed. He recognizes moments when he withdraws unnecessarily. He senses when fear, rather than reality, shapes his reactions. And in these moments of recognition, a new question begins forming quietly within him, one that carries both hope and uncertainty, one that he may not yet be ready to answer aloud, but that continues to grow stronger with each passing moment of connection, one that carries both hope and uncertainty, because the question forming inside him is no longer about whether he feels love, but whether he has the courage to live in alignment with what he feels. And this is where the inner tension becomes more personal, more intimate, almost unavoidable. He begins to sense that love is no longer an abstract feeling drifting quietly in the background of his life. It is becoming a living force, shaping his thoughts, influencing his choices, and challenging the habits that once felt natural. I have often seen that when a man reaches this stage, his inner world becomes more active than ever before. Thoughts repeat themselves late at night. Memories resurface unexpectedly. Situations that once seemed insignificant now appear charged with meaning. This is not confusion alone. It is the psyche attempting to reorganize itself around a new emotional center. And you, whether you realize it or not, have become part of that center, not as a solution to his struggles, but as a mirror reflecting the parts of himself he has not yet fully explored. When he interacts with you, he is not only responding to your presence, he is responding to the version of himself that emerges in your presence. That version may feel more open, more honest, more emotionally alive than the one he shows to the outside world. This difference can feel unsettling, because when we encounter a more authentic version of ourselves, we also encounter the distance between who we are and who we have been pretending to be. That distance creates discomfort, not unbearable discomfort, but a quiet restlessness that pushes the psyche toward change. There is also a growing awareness inside him that love cannot remain hidden forever. Feelings that reach a certain depth eventually demand expression. They seek movement, language, action, yet expression requires risk. It requires stepping beyond observation into participation. And participation means allowing another person to influence your emotional reality. For someone who has long protected his inner world, this step feels enormous. I sometimes imagine this stage as standing before a doorway that has always existed but was never opened. He knows what lies behind it may change the direction of his life. He senses possibility, warmth, and connection. But he also senses unpredictability, the unknown territory of shared vulnerability. The unknown is what activates the deepest fears of the unconscious, not because it is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar. The psyche prefers patterns it recognizes, even when those patterns limit growth. So as he stands before this doorway, he may hesitate, not out of indifference, but out of reverence for the magnitude of what he feels. Reverence is rarely discussed in psychological language, yet it plays a quiet role in deep emotional experiences. When love feels meaningful, it creates a sense of responsibility, not imposed from outside, but generated within. He may feel responsible for protecting the connection, for not mishandling the emotions involved, for not repeating mistakes he once made in other relationships or in earlier stages of life. This sense of responsibility can feel heavy at times. It may cause him to move carefully, to weigh his words, to analyze his actions more than usual. What appears as hesitation may actually be contemplation. What appears as distance may actually be preparation. Because transformation does not happen through impulse alone. It requires integration, the careful blending of old experiences with new understanding. Inside him, two identities may still be negotiating their coexistence. One identity shaped by survival, caution, and independence. The other identity emerging through love, connection, and emotional honesty. Neither identity disappears immediately. Instead, they overlap, creating moments of contradiction that feel confusing to both of you. There may be days when he appears completely certain, emotionally present, and deeply connected. On those days, the emerging self feels stronger. He trusts his feelings more. He allows warmth to flow without resistance. But then there may be days when he withdraws slightly, returning to familiar habits of distance. On those days, the older self regains temporary control, reminding him of past fears and protective instincts. This fluctuation is not failure. It is movement. Movement between old and new, between protection and openness, between fear and trust. Each oscillation teaches the psyche something valuable. Each moment of closeness provides evidence that vulnerability does not always lead to harm. Each moment of retreat offers an opportunity to reflect on why the retreat happened in the first place. Over time, these repeated experiences create a subtle but powerful shift in his internal landscape. He begins to notice patterns within himself with greater clarity. He recognizes the exact moments when fear rises unexpectedly. He becomes aware of the internal voice that urges caution even when there is no immediate threat. Awareness like this is transformative, because once he can observe his own reactions, he gains the ability to choose differently. Instead of withdrawing automatically, he may pause. Instead of silencing his feelings, he may consider expressing them even in small ways. These choices may seem minor from the outside, but psychologically they represent enormous progress. There is also an emerging curiosity inside him, a curiosity about his own emotional capacity. He may begin to ask himself questions he has never asked before. Questions about what love truly means to him. Questions about how much closeness he is willing to allow. Questions about whether his fears are still relevant to his present reality. Curiosity weakens fear, not immediately, but gradually. When the psyche becomes curious, it shifts from defensive reaction to exploratory awareness. Instead of assuming danger, it begins to investigate possibilities. This shift marks a turning point in his emotional development, even if he does not recognize it consciously. Yet, despite all these internal movements, one final layer of complexity continues to linger beneath the surface. Because loving deeply is not only about overcoming fear, it is about accepting responsibility for the impact of one's presence in another person's life. He may begin to sense that his choices now carry weight beyond himself, that his silence, his hesitation, his expressions of affection, all of these shape the emotional atmosphere between you. And recognizing this influence can feel both empowering and intimidating. Empowering, because it reveals the depth of connection that exists. Intimidating, because it means he can no longer remain emotionally neutral. He must either step forward into greater honesty or retreat into distance, knowing that either choice carries consequences. This awareness creates a quiet pressure within him. A pressure not imposed by you, but generated by his own conscience, his own growing understanding of what love requires. And as this pressure builds slowly over time, he may find himself standing once again at that inner threshold, sensing that the next step he takes will not only define the relationship between you, but will also determine whether he is ready to face the most hidden truth waiting within his own shadow. A truth that has remained unspoken for years, quietly shaping his fears, his hopes, and the complicated way he continues to love you while still learning what it truly means to.